June 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched across half the globe, a vast battlefield where empires collided and the fate of nations hung in the balance. Just 6 months earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had stunned the United States and crippled much of the American Pacific Fleet. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces surged forward with unstoppable momentum, capturing territory at a pace that shocked the world. To many observers, Japan seemed invincible. Its navy was battle-hardened, experienced, and commanded by some of the most skilled admirals of the era. At the center of this power stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a long war against America's industrial might. His strategy was simple but bold: deliver a decisive blow that would force the United States to negotiate peace. His next target was a tiny speck of land in the Central Pacific, Midway Atoll. Midway was more than a remote outpost. It was a strategic gateway to Hawaii and a critical American base for reconnaissance and refueling. If Japan captured Midway, it could extend its defensive perimeter, threaten Pearl Harbor again, and potentially force the U.S. Navy into a final, decisive battle on Japanese terms. But thousands of miles away from the front lines, in a quiet basement office at Pearl Harbor, a small group of American cryptanalysts was preparing to change the course of history. They worked in a unit known as Station HYPO, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort. Unlike the glamorous image of wartime heroism, their battlefield was filled with paper, radio intercepts, and the relentless tapping of typewriters. Day and night, Rochefort and his team studied fragments of encrypted Japanese communications, attempting to break the Imperial Navy's complex code system known as JN-25. JN-25 was considered nearly unbreakable. It used thousands of code groups and constantly changing encryption keys. Yet Rochefort believed that with patience and persistence, patterns would emerge. For weeks, the cryptanalysts intercepted messages referring to a mysterious target labeled only as AF. Japanese transmissions suggested that AF would soon be attacked in a major operation. Rochefort was convinced that AF meant Midway, but he needed proof. Without confirmation, the U.S. Navy could not risk committing its limited carrier forces to a potential trap. Rochefort devised a simple but brilliant plan. He asked Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting a failure in its water distillation plant. Shortly afterward, American intercept stations picked up a Japanese message stating that AF is short of water. It was the confirmation Rochefort needed. Japan was coming for Midway. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, faced an extraordinary decision. American naval strength was fragile. The battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor were still under repair. Only 3 operational aircraft carriers were available: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, which had been damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Many believed these carriers should be preserved, not risked in a high-stakes confrontation. Nimitz chose the opposite. He decided to gamble everything on an ambush. Using Rochefort's intelligence, Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the expected search patterns of Japanese reconnaissance. The plan was daring. Allow the Japanese fleet to approach Midway, then strike with carrier-based aircraft at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto assembled one of the most powerful naval forces ever put to sea. At its core were 4 elite aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the spearhead of Japan's naval air power. Commanded tactically by Admiral Nagumo, this carrier strike force carried hundreds of experienced pilots and aircraft. The Japanese believed they held the advantage in numbers, experience, and surprise. They did not know that their plans had been exposed. As the fleets converged across the Pacific, tension mounted aboard the American carriers. Pilots prepared their aircraft. Deck crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. Radar operators scanned the horizon. Every man understood the stakes. Defeat could leave Hawaii exposed and shift the balance of the Pacific War irreversibly in Japan's favor. On Midway itself, American forces braced for attack. Marines and Navy personnel reinforced defenses, while land-based aircraft stood ready to launch. The tiny atoll became the bait in a carefully constructed trap. Before dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft roared off the decks of Nagumo's carriers, heading toward Midway in the opening strike of the operation. As the first bombs began to fall on the island, American radar detected the incoming wave. Fighters scrambled to intercept, and anti-aircraft guns thundered into action. The Battle of Midway had begun, but even as explosions rocked the atoll, a larger drama was unfolding far beyond the horizon. American carrier forces were already moving into position, guided by intelligence that the Japanese commanders could not imagine had been compromised. In the next few hours, a series of decisions, sacrifices, and moments of extraordinary courage would determine the fate of fleets and the future of the Pacific War. What neither side yet realized was that they were on the brink of one of the most decisive naval engagements in history, a battle that would hinge on timing, intelligence, and the willingness of ordinary men to fly into overwhelming danger. As dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the Japanese strike force closed in on Midway Atoll with confidence. Admiral Nagumo's pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and countless earlier victories, descended on the island in tight formation. Bombs exploded across airfields and installations, sending pillars of smoke into the sky. But Midway did not collapse. American anti-aircraft fire filled the air with black bursts of flak. Marine and Navy fighters clawed upward to intercept. Though many were shot down by the more maneuverable Japanese Zero fighters, their resistance forced the attackers to maneuver and expend precious fuel and ammunition. When the first wave returned to Nagumo's carriers, its commander radioed an urgent assessment. Midway was damaged but not destroyed. A second strike would be necessary. Nagumo now faced a critical decision. His aircraft were originally armed with bombs for land attack, while reserve planes below decks were fitted with torpedoes for use against enemy ships. At 7:15 a.m., believing no American fleet was nearby, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with bombs for another strike on Midway. This decision would prove catastrophic. As Japanese deck crews worked feverishly to swap weapons in crowded hangars filled with fuel lines and munitions, a scout plane launched from a Japanese cruiser transmitted a delayed and incomplete message. Enemy ships sighted. Confusion rippled through Nagumo's flagship, the carrier Akagi. Were these ships a major threat or just a small force? Minutes later, an update arrived confirming the worst. An American carrier was present. Nagumo immediately reversed his order. The reserve aircraft had to be rearmed again, this time with torpedoes for an anti-ship strike. In the cramped hangar decks, bombs and torpedoes lay scattered, fuel hoses snaked across the floor, and aircraft were being shuffled into position. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable moment. At the same time, American forces were launching their own desperate attacks. From Midway itself, waves of land-based bombers and torpedo planes struck first. Flying obsolete aircraft and facing intense fighter opposition, they pressed their attacks with extraordinary bravery. Most failed to score hits. Many were shot down. Yet their assaults forced Japanese combat air patrols to remain low and distracted. Then came the carrier-based torpedo squadrons. From USS Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Waldron, flew toward the enemy in slow, vulnerable TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Waldron, convinced the main fleet lay to the southwest, broke from his carrier's planned course and led his squadron directly toward the Japanese carriers. They found them. What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. As Waldron's squadron descended to attack, Japanese Zero fighters swarmed them. The Devastators had no fighter escort and were painfully slow. One by one, they were shot from the sky. Pilots held their course through walls of gunfire, determined to launch their torpedoes. Not a single torpedo hit. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one man survived. Ensign George Gay, who floated in the ocean and witnessed the rest of the battle unfold. Other American torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown followed, suffering similarly devastating losses. Their attacks appeared futile, yet their sacrifice achieved something crucial. They dragged the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level and scattered it across the sky. High above, unseen and nearly out of fuel, American dive bombers were searching desperately for the enemy fleet. Commander Wade McClusky, leading Enterprise's air group, made a fateful decision. Instead of turning back when his search ran long, he continued on a calculated course, hoping to intercept the Japanese. Then he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north at high speed. Recognizing it as a likely escort rushing to rejoin the main fleet, McClusky followed its wake. Minutes later, the clouds parted to reveal the Japanese carriers below. They were perfectly exposed. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers plunged from the sky. Sirens wailed aboard the Japanese carriers as lookouts shouted warnings. But it was too late. With fighter cover pulled low by the torpedo attacks and decks cluttered with fueled and armed aircraft, the carriers were defenseless. Bombs struck with devastating precision. On Kaga, multiple direct hits ignited massive explosions, turning the hangar deck into an inferno. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was crippled by a single bomb that detonated among armed aircraft, unleashing uncontrollable fires. Soryu was struck repeatedly, engulfed in flames within minutes. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were mortally wounded. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted in those moments, though the battle was not yet over. The surviving carrier, Hiryu, quickly launched counterstrikes. Its aircraft found USS Yorktown, scoring bomb and torpedo hits that left the American carrier burning and dead in the water. Damage control crews fought heroically to save the ship, and for a time it seemed Yorktown might survive. But American scouts soon located Hiryu. That afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise and the damaged Yorktown launched a final coordinated strike. They found Hiryu maneuvering desperately, its decks crowded with aircraft preparing another attack. Once again, American bombs found their mark. Hiryu was set ablaze and abandoned by her crew. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were lost. The sea was littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and survivors clinging to debris. Fires burned through the darkness as both fleets withdrew. Stunned by the scale of destruction, the cost had been immense. American torpedo squadrons were nearly wiped out. Hundreds of pilots and sailors on both sides were dead. Yet the strategic consequences were unmistakable. Japan's elite carrier force, the core of its offensive power, had been shattered in a single day. What remained was to secure the victory and understand its meaning. The events of June 4th had not only destroyed ships, they had shattered the illusion of Japanese naval invincibility. The next phase of the battle would determine how decisively that victory could be exploited, and how it would shape the future of the war in the Pacific. By the evening of June 4th, 1942, the waters around Midway were littered with burning wreckage, scattered aircraft, and survivors clinging desperately to life rafts. The battle had claimed hundreds of men from both sides. Yet amidst the chaos, a monumental truth had emerged. The Japanese Navy's offensive power had been broken. For the first time, the Allies had decisively defeated Japan's carrier force in a pitched naval engagement. The significance of Midway cannot be overstated. In just one day, the United States had destroyed 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carriers that had been the spearhead of the Pearl Harbor attack and symbolized Japanese naval dominance. These losses were irrecoverable. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace their experienced pilots or carriers quickly, leaving the Japanese Navy reeling and unable to launch large-scale offensive operations in the Pacific. On the American side, the cost was high but far outweighed the strategic gains. USS Yorktown, badly damaged during the battle, was ultimately lost the following day to a Japanese submarine, and several squadrons had been decimated. Yet the courage of the pilots, especially those in torpedo squadrons who attacked without fighter cover and knew they were likely to be annihilated, had set the stage for the decisive dive bomber strikes that destroyed the Japanese carriers. Their sacrifice directly enabled the American victory. Behind the scenes, intelligence and preparation had been critical. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort's codebreakers at Station HYPO had uncovered Japan's plans weeks in advance. By decrypting Jan. 25, they had provided Admiral Nimitz with exact locations, enabling him to place his carriers precisely where the Japanese fleet would be most vulnerable. This combination of human intelligence, technical skill, and strategic foresight turned what could have been a desperate gamble into a carefully orchestrated ambush. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory at Midway validated his bold decision to commit the three available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, despite the risks. His faith in intelligence, careful positioning, and the skill of his pilots had paid off. The American Navy had not only avenged Pearl Harbor, but had also seized the initiative in the Pacific, marking the start of a strategic shift that would define the remainder of World War II. The battle also highlighted the heroism and innovation of American aviators. Dive bomber pilots like Wade McClusky of Enterprise and Dick Best of Yorktown executed precise attacks under harrowing conditions, often navigating without modern instrumentation and under intense anti-aircraft fire. Their ability to adapt in real time, identify targets, and execute coordinated strikes demonstrated a level of skill and bravery that would become legendary. Beyond the tactical and strategic elements, the psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese morale suffered immensely as news of the carrier losses spread. Commanders realized that the Americans could anticipate and counter their moves, challenging the perception of Japanese invincibility. Conversely, American morale soared. For a nation still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, Midway was proof that Japan's advance could be halted and reversed. In the months following Midway, the United States began its island-hopping campaign, moving from one strategic location to another, slowly closing in on Japan's home islands. Midway had set the stage, providing not only a template for operational planning but also a confidence that bold strategy, combined with intelligence and decisive action, could overcome a seemingly superior enemy. Ultimately, the Battle of Midway was more than a naval engagement. It was a turning point. It demonstrated that intelligence gathering, careful planning, and courageous execution could change the course of a war. It shifted the balance in the Pacific, halted Japanese expansion, and cemented the United States as the dominant naval power in the region. The story of Midway is remembered not just for the ships sunk or the pilots lost, but for the combination of foresight, bravery, and sacrifice that made victory possible. From the codebreakers in dimly lit rooms to the aviators diving into death from the skies, Midway is a testament to the extraordinary lengths ordinary men and women went to defend their nation and turn the tide of history. In the end, the 6 minutes in which the Japanese carriers were destroyed reshaped the Pacific War, ensuring that the Allies would take the fight to Japan's doorstep and setting the stage for victory in the Pacific.